They put a couple buttons and we will be set to go. All right, let's see. First, we have some observations from somebody who attends these talks, and they're good observations because they are from a physician, so they're reliable. It is about the ends of looking at the life in halves. At the very beginning and at the very end, there is a reflection. And the first one is vision, that infants have limited distance vision. And best vision is approximately the distance from the breast to the patient's eyes, so about 6 inches. Very nearsighted. Elderly have difficulties with near vision. Babies have limited dexterity, as do the elderly. Babies in the elderly do not have a lot of hair. Balance is difficult for both. Very young babies and very old people are mostly asexual. So, some observations indicating what we have been talking about. Now we're ready to look into the thirds of life astrologically. In doing that, I have to mention there are different kinds of astrology. And in these talks, for the most part, we're going to deal with the most simple and widely used astrology. It works, and it gets at the information that we want to get at. Astrology also has many uses. And some of the things about astrology have nothing to do with horoscopes. For example, astrology is part of our language, part of our culture. If we say someone is Mercurial or Saturnian or Martial, we're usually not speaking directly about their horoscope. Those are just terms that we use in the language. Quite often, those terms are consistent with astrology, but it's not true astrology. If we look at the days of the week are based on astrology and mythology. They come from a much different kind of astrology than we're doing here. It's a more cosmological kind of astrology. We'll come into some of that later on in a few months from now, but not much. The quality of planetary days, like Monday, ruled by the moon, it agrees with the quality of the moon that we use in regular natal astrology. If you want a fancy word for what you're doing, it is sometimes called genethliacal astrology, which is the study of horoscopes. Now, when we use the same qualities of Monday for the moon and Venus for Friday, Freya, which is the Norse Venus, we're not actually talking about astrology, but we are talking about qualities. So, astrology is embedded in our culture. Now, if we take a common word that you're going to hear a lot in these talks, we're going to hear it several times this evening, the word consider. The word consider is actually an astrological word. Con means to bring together, as in construction or construe or conclave, something like that. And cider or Sidus is Latin for star. So consider means to bring the stars together, which is what an astrologer is doing. Now, the first way we're going to look at the thirds of a lifetime is cultural, more like using the word mercurial. It will be descriptive of the thirds, but not necessarily of horoscopes. It is traditional, and it is about what are called planetary opposites. And planetary opposites are planets which complement each other perfectly, and they're usually gender complementary also. So we have the Sun and the Moon, and we have Mars and Venus, and we have Jupiter and Saturn, and we have Uranus and Neptune. Those are all planetary opposites. Mercury and Pluto do not have planetary opposites, and they don't really give themselves to gendered qualities in any which way. They're both sort of aloof, asexual in a way. Now, the way we're looking at the thirds of life, the first third of life is said to be like Mars and Venus. It's all about energy and romance, and it's about competition, and it's about socialization and things of that nature. So we can say that the first third of life has that kind of quality to it. The second third of life in this kind of broad description is ruled by Sun and Moon. In some schools of thought, Sun and Moon rule more than just the central third. It's the large part of the center of a life cycle are ruled by the Sun and the Moon. And the Sun and the Moon are planetary parents. So the second third is all about producing and maintaining family. And the Sun and the Moon in their cycles with each other are all about accomplishment. In each lunation cycle, there are things that are accomplished. And that middle third of life is the time when we accomplish all of the things that we're going to accomplish. The third third of life is usually ruled by Jupiter and Saturn. We become more expressive and more generous in the third third of life. Our faith increases, our willingness to believe in things increases, and we're actually more gullible. All of those are Jupiterian types of qualities. I've had several friends that have been taken in by scams in their older ages. At the same time, older ages, we feel more limitation. The Saturnine quality of hardening everything from our skin to making our bones brittle, all of those things are Saturnine. And older people, despite gullibility, are much more cautious, and many of them are fearful. As a younger astrologer, I watched this in the older generation, and I promised myself that I would never become a fearful old person. But you have to watch out, and you have to take faith, because otherwise that creeps in. And the older people usually are deeper. We have the wise old woman or the wise old man as Jungian archetypes, and that's very Saturnian. Now, the tendency to faith and religion are stronger in the third third of life. However, not everyone gets into sophisticated spirituality. So therefore, Uranus and Neptune can be very important in the third third of life, but they don't often do so. You know, people become more sensitive to spiritual things, but they don't become mystics. Older people are accepting of phenomena, spiritual phenomena, and it's just that it doesn't become a way of life for them. Even if there is a strong Uranus and Neptune, a person might have aesthetic taste, or a person might be very sensitive, but that doesn't necessarily indicate mysticism. It may indicate more insights and more talents. So, all right, that is a descriptive way of looking at the thirds of life, the 3/3 of life. And it is traditional. This is something that's been among astrologers for probably hundreds of years. I know it's at least it's in decades in my own life. Now, the question that comes up when we discuss something like this is, does this apply to horoscopy, to horoscopes as we're looking at it now? And the answer to that question is maybe. Success in astrology depends on 3 things: observation, intuition, and judgment. Good, sound judgment. Judgment is probably the most important, because a lot of people get intuitions, but they don't judge whether they're interpreting their intuitions correctly. In fact, judgment is so important to astrology that, as well as being called genethliacal astrology, sometimes astrology is called judicial astrology. These are all terms that have been around for a long time. Now, if a person does have a really strong Mars or Venus, or both better, it will indicate a classic first third of life, especially energetic or especially socialized. But if there are not standout planets, this might not apply. And even if Mars and Venus are very strong, you still do not know whether a person is going to have a classic early third of life. It's possible that somebody might have Saturn in the first house. And no matter how strong Venus and Mars are, if Saturn in the first house is blocking early unfoldment or early development, it isn't going to come out. So this is what I hope you can understand that this is something that astrology is all about. It is judgment. We have to judge what is more important and what is less important. You're going to get, in the course of these talks, you're going to run into all sorts of information. And I'll try to point out how to judge which is more important than which, but in any case, you're always going to have to judge. You have to consider everything. That's that word again, consider. You're going to hear it again and again in these talks. Usually, directly horoscopical things are much more important than the descriptives like Mars and Venus or Jupiter and Saturn. All right, now we're ready to dig in. And actually, it's time to introduce more astrological determinants of the thirds of life. Now we're going to look at several of these. We'll get only one tonight, and maybe next time we meet we'll get 2 or 3 more. There are quite a few of them, and we'll see how they all fit together. It's really beautiful the way astrology relates to life and how you can understand life very well by using astrology. Now, normally, if you're among astrologers, you'll hear of only one determinant for the thirds of life. And it's discussed frequently by astrologers, but they miss all of the others, and that is a very egregious error. We'll try to correct that error, but it's not likely that we're going to change the world at large with these simple talks with just a few of us. But I'm not responsible for changing the world at large. I make my contribution, and it goes no further than that. But I am responsible for giving students accurate and significant information. So I'll endeavor to do that. Now we have to do something that I hate to do. We are going to superficially introduce techniques used for understanding time in life. And we need them in order to come to an understanding of the thirds. Now, I hate to do anything superficially, but sometimes it is necessary. It's necessary that it be superficial because if we went into a full introduction, it would take us too far away from what we're trying to do. And we're trying to have a cogent view of this and bring it all together without going into an enormously long side trip. It isn't a side trip, but it would take away from what we're trying to do. We might lose focus, and we want to keep focus. Now, you can be assured that even though what we're going to do in the next few minutes is superficial, we will come back to it, and we will get a more thorough rendition when it is appropriate. In fact, for some parts of it, I'm even thinking of inviting in a guest astrologer to do some of the more technical mathematical things, because the person I have in mind is a much more proficient person in the technical side of things. I don't know about the other part of it with him. All right, here we go. Remember, you don't have to grasp all of this information and understand it pellucidly at this time. Again, it'll come back when we need it. Now, there are two categories of methods that are used by astrology to determine time and futurity. One is a direct method, and one is indirect. Now, the Nativity, the natal horoscope, is a blueprint for the entire life. The Nativity is a representation of the creative archetype that we created together with the divine beings and those with whom we will interact. We created it before we came to birth. Everything of our life is in the natal horoscope, but it is so condensed and our consciousness is so limited, sometimes so shallow, that we can't bring it out or we can't comprehend it. So you have to draw it out. And the process of life is the drawing out of that archetype as we live it out. And if you study astrology and you do so for a long period of your life, you can see what one part of your horoscope meant when you see it in action. It becomes externalized, it becomes an objective reality. Now, the relationship of the heavens at any given moment, like this moment, to the natal horoscope is one way that the natal horoscope is being brought out in the moment. We're saying that in any given moment, we are relating to the astrological environment. And the way we, as indicated in our natal horoscopes, are relating to that environment is a way that we come to understand what is in us. This is the direct means. It is a direct relationship between what is happening in the world, what is happening in the heavens, and our life. The direct relationship is based on what are called transits. Transits. A transit is an astronomical term. In astronomy, you have a north-south line that goes from the North Pole to the South Pole that passes right overhead. And any time a heavenly body or a star or a cusp or something like that comes to that line, it is called a transit. It's a meridian line. It's sometimes called, if you look in astronomy books, it is called a transit of the meridian. That's not the way astrologers use it. The way astrology uses it is any time an astrological significator passes over a significant point in the natal horoscope, that is called a transit of that point. That is to say, every year on your birthday, the sun transits your natal sun because it's back in the same position where it was. Every month, the moon passes over your sun, and that is called a transit. Now, transits activate or bring things out, and they don't only bring things out that are in the natal horoscope. What's happening out in the heavens colors what's coming out of the individual. We're actually reacting to the astrological environment. Now, when a planet, when something transits a planet, it's called a transiting conjunction, because the conjunction is the most basic aspect of all aspects. You might say that the conjunction is the aspect's aspect. It's that way even in the astrology of India. I guess I shouldn't get in there. However, over the years, astrologers began using not only conjunctions, but oppositions, sort of like what some people call your unbirthday, the day when the sun is opposite your sun. And that also activates the sun, but not as intensely. Now, conjunctions and oppositions are sure bets when it comes to understanding or finding astrological phenomena. But what happens is now astrologers use all kinds of aspects, biquintiles and things like that, transiting, and that's not so fine. You may try to do something like that to understand something. Sometimes you're successful, sometimes you aren't. But sometimes astrologers tend to get too much into trying all kinds of astrological techniques instead of just pondering or praying on it or trying to intuit what something means. And the dynamic part of astrology, the part that we're studying now, is the least well-developed part of astrology. All right. Now we're ready to look into the indirect means, and they're much more difficult to understand. And their basis is difficult for coming to an understanding. Indirect methods used in astrology include directions, which is a special term which we will come to eventually. Just say right now that there is such a thing as directions, and progressions, various different types and flavors of progressions. For the moment, we are only going to be using what are called secondary progressions. And we want to understand what a progression is, especially what a secondary progression is. Suppose we have a clear lake, and we take a drone out to the middle of the lake, and we drop a stone into the water. What we see is on the clear, still lake, we see circles of waves going out from where the stone was dropped in. And the further away from the stone the waves are, the broader they are, but they're also shallower. There are intervals between where the waves occur. And we'll talk about those in a more thorough elucidation. The waves carry the information about the impact. And for astrology, the impact is the moment of birth. That is the horoscope. And it's an extremely condensed moment at the moment of birth. So quite a lot of information is carried out in waves. The initial impact is expanded into the first ring. And there is, in the first wave, as in all of the others, there is a extension or a delineation of the initial impact. But there is also a thinning, so that that first wave is not the same thing as the initial impact. It's much weaker. Now, some information can be carried from the impact of the first wave, and then from the first wave to the second wave, and so on. By studying the delineated first wave, which is probably the most significant, relative to the natal impact, we can see things expanded, almost like if you look at a star, you can see something, but if you use a telescope, you can see much more in the expansion. However, in the telescope, you introduce more error also, and you introduce it's not this, it's not the same thing. You're causing an expanded image, and that image is not meaningful. Now, it turns out that what can be seen in that first wave relate to things in all of the other waves. So that you might say that if you get out to the uttermost ring, so that we're at the edge of the lake, that is the present. And so there are things that were always there in the natal horoscope, but in the first ring they are expanded, and so that when things are carried out into the present, we could see that they were coming already in the first ring. There's something like a harmonic between all of the rings, but that's again something we're not ready to go into at this time. Now, over many thousands of years, astrologers have found a workable relationship between the first wave and the succeeding waves leading to the present. And it involves a universal principle in astrology. It is a harmonic kind of thing. It has been found over thousands of years that if the first wave is considered as one day after birth, when it comes to being lived out in the bigger picture in the lifetime, that first day is like the first year. And so the second day is like the second year. So one day equals 1 year. This has been found, and it's proven again and again, and probably almost every astrologer that has ever studied astrology has worked with this and has some understanding of it. So in the first 36 hours after birth, you have the first 18 months of life. Now, this method of working with time in the future is called a secondary progression. The initial progression, or the start, is the impact. And these are secondary progressions. Now, this is the method of dealing with time and futurity that is used by most astrologers. And for the time being, this is the method that we are going to be using, especially this evening. All right, now we are ready to examine the thirds of life. And we're going to do this in several ways. Tonight will be one way, next time will be one or two ways, and after that it'll take about 4 sessions to get through all of this. But when we get through it, you'll have an understanding of the early part of life so that you can work with and try to see what's going on when something comes up that you don't understand and people don't normally understand. All right. Now, each way gives us a different view or quality of the different thirds. Now, all of the way that we are going to look at the 3 thirds in life are important. Some of the outlooks are more important than others. And some of the outlooks are more important in the first or the last third, and some are more important in the second third, just as we talked about earlier with the sun and the moon being more important in the middle part of life. Now, the first definition of the thirds of life that we are examining is the cycle of the progressed moon. The sidereal cycle of the moon is 28 days. It's not the same thing as a lunation cycle. A sidereal cycle is when a body is at a point in the heavens and then it goes in its circuit until it comes back to that same point. The lunation cycle is when there is a conjunction of the sun and the moon until the next conjunction of the sun and moon. The lunation cycle is longer. It has to be because during the time that the moon was going around, the sun has moved forward and it has to go more than 360 degrees. So a lunation cycle takes 28 days, whereas a sidereal cycle, which is what we're looking at, takes 28 days, where a lunation cycle takes a little bit more than 29 days. The point in the heavens that we use for determining the progressed lunar cycle is the natal position of the moon. A cycle is 28 days after birth. The moon is right back to where it was when we began. And that's called a progressed lunar return. Now, the moon, like all of the other significators, astrologic, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, whatever, all of them rule many, many different things. And some of them apply and are important, and some are not so important as others. The significance of the moon is especially important, which is why we're studying it as determining the first third of life. Mind you, it should be clear now that what we're saying is that the first third of life is 28 years after birth. From age 0 or at birth until age 28 is the first third of life. Now, the moon is the mother of all of us. The mother nurtures, the mother protects, the mother educates, and the mother cares for everything. The moon, beside ruling motherhood, rules fluids. The most important fluid that is ruled by the moon is water, but the lymph and the plasma are also ruled by the moon. Now, mystics find that there is a very strong affinity between water and the ethers, especially the life ether, so that water will absorb a lot or hold a lot of life ether. We find this if you go into the grocery store. You look at the leafy vegetables, every now and then somebody comes along and mists them because the with the water on the surface of the leafy vegetables, it is able to draw back more life ether out of the environment to replace what has been lost by the normal dehydration process. So that's why this is done. Everything that lives must have water. So, from putting these facts together, we understand that the moon rules biological activity in the most basic sense. Anything that lives is subject to the moon through the presence of water. Now, the nurturative nature of the moon indicates biological development. At some time or another, we're going to look at the moon relative to the prenatal epoch, before a person is born, and what we can gather from that. But for right now, the moon governs biological development and maintenance. So, the first third of life, obviously, when we look at it, is all about development. There are sciences that are dedicated to development because it's important to understand, because if development doesn't take place in a proper way, a person in adulthood will be at a disadvantage. There will be some kind of weakness or something not there for them. Now we have to go into a little bit of very simple mathematics. Let's talk about the square. A perfect square is a figure that represents building, or it represents construction. The walls of this building have to be square and at right angles to the surface of the earth. If they aren't, gravity will gradually pull them down. Even the matter that is in the stuff of these walls is formed around a vector of energy at right angles, and that right angles is the square. So the very stuff that we're working with is ruled by the square. Now, the arithmetic equivalent of the square is the number 4. So in cyclical constructive activities, which is what development is, the phases of development come in 4s. The 4 seasons, the 4 quarters of the day according to the sun are good examples. So it's not surprising then that the quarters of the progressed lunar cycle are important to development. Now, the progressed moon is 90 degrees from its home position after 7 years. Now, this is significant, and it has nothing to do with some superstition about the number 7. Every 7 years, almost every atom in the body is replaced. The replacement differs in different parts of the body. Obviously, the bones is going to be much different than the blood. The turning points, that is the square points, are very important in the lunation cycle. Every 90 degrees or every 7 years. Now, in human physiology, a 7-year period, and the important change that comes at that turning point is called a climacterix. Climacterix. And there are 4 climacterices in every lunation cycle. Some are more important than the others. There are some that are called the great climacterices. Now, physiologists don't do much with the climacterices anymore, and that's a huge mistake. And we'll want to see why. Now, in the progressed lunar cycle, important events in human development take place. We remember, we're talking about this is the cycle of development. At age 7, the permanent teeth come in. Big change. At age 14, puberty occurs. At age 21, majority is reached. And at age 28, the development cycle is completed. Now, if you remember from a talk, 1 or 2 talks ago, we talked about, we said that they won't train jet pilots after age 28 because by then their reflexes are going. So the perfection of the physical body and the completion of its development takes place at age 28. Now, during the first 7 years, one is primarily a physical being. If a little child, a tot, has an owie, its whole existence is challenged because its whole existence is in its physical being. During the second 7 years, the etheric vital body comes into play. And when that happens, there's the period of rapid growth. So if you tell a child, if you don't eat your spinach, you're not going to grow, you're threatening that child with the most important thing that's happening in its life at that time. At 14, the emotional nature is born. And all teenagers are romantics. Look at teen music of any generation. It's very, very romantic. Even if you're calling your girlfriend a whore, it's still romantic. So in the teenage years, you can hurt someone's feelings because their identity is with their emotional nature. At 21, the mind comes into play. At 21, a person can then control the emotions through the mind. But a person still identifies with the mind. And if you take a young thinker and you challenge their argument, you're challenging their very being. And it isn't until 28 when the spirit comes into its own and its vehicles are what it uses, the spirit is what counts. And so an older person is not hurt if you challenge their argument. Now, when this is laid out, questions come to mind. It's too perfect. And the first thing that is brought up as a criticism of it is that nature doesn't follow this timetable. There are some early developers and there are some late developers. And there are even trends, like puberty seems to be happening generally at an earlier age. But that's exactly the point we're trying to make. No two horoscopes are identical, and no two periods of time are identical, and the time is flavored astrologically. This means that the progressed lunar aspects, as it passes over the different planets, whether it's in the first septenary or the second or the fourth, as it passes over those planets, those indicate variations or deviations. Progressed aspects of the moon passing over Uranus might indicate fabulous growth spurts. However, the progressed moon passing over Saturn would indicate deficiencies or blockages, and you might have something where you have something like dwarfism. Now, the possibilities are numerous, way too numerous to give them out in a short talk like this. This is something that when you're working with a chart and you're seeing something coming up in a child's life, that's when that's when you start pondering and when you start looking for intuitions to understand it. The reason I just chuckled there, because that's the way I got formally into astrology. I cast a horoscope for a friend's child, and I saw an important period coming up in the child's life, and I didn't know how to deal with it. So I realized I had to have much further study and much better understanding before I could mess around with people's lives like that. Now, intuition can also help you with the extreme cases. Probably the most extreme case is getting stuck. Some people never get out of their teens, and there are what we used to call 40-year-old teeny boppers. Some people actually never get out of their childhood, and they want to, if things come up in life that are too difficult for them, they head for the video games. You know, it's all of that. If there's a blockage and a person gets stuck, they might be a romantic and emotional romantic all of their life, or they might be a teenage rebel. And if you can understand what in their character is responsible for that, you can go a long way for helping them through a life that might otherwise be greatly limited. And when the progressed moon passes over a planet at the time that blockage or that rush forward is, you have a means to understand what's going on. Now, this way of looking at the first third of life can be used to great benefit. One of the best applications of this is not even astrological. It is Waldorf Education. In Waldorf Education, they won't allow you to start school until you have set your permanent teeth. Unless you're changing your teeth, you're not ready for school. It means, it said, the idea of Waldorf education is that education has to match development. If you look at a lot of education now, it's just a spectacular extravaganza. How much knowledge can we pour into a child at an early age? You might produce very knowledgeable children, but knowledgeable children that are not growing up in the most healthy way for their complete personal development to function in life. And so Waldorf education is like that. It's not meant to harm people. So optimal education occurs when education is matched to development. Now, in Waldorf education, if it's done right, a teacher spends time with each and every student and tries to understand these deviations, why some are progressing faster and some are progressing slower, because each has individual needs and each has a different progressed lunar cycle. Now, it would be wonderful if Waldorf teachers and all teachers studied astrology and had the horoscopes of their children, and they could see why one might be hesitant about learning certain things or is just not ready for them and not equipped for it. That's a very valuable thing. But I think it'll be a while yet before teachers are astrologers also. If you don't have a teacher, you can just find a spiritual astrologer, not somebody that's a fortune teller or something like that. You can get help if you get a spiritual astrologer with trying to understand what's best for your child's education. All right. We're going to be less than an hour tonight. Wow, that's wonderful. I'll be just as tired anyway. All right. As you can see, just in what we have looked at this evening with the progressed lunar cycle, things can become very complicated very quickly. Astrologers tend to like complication, and sometimes in their love of complication, they miss the forest for the trees. I think that it's sometimes better to not use all kinds of astrological technique and to instead spend a lot of time pondering, because each of us has the capacity to understand anything. And so if we spend our time in doing that rather than learning too much technique, it's probably a good idea. It's also a pretty good idea to keep to the basics. In this, we don't want to look at progressed lunar sextiles, for example, because that isn't applicable. And you're just spending a lot of time on something. There might be an effect, but the effect is so mild. It's sort of like the effect of a draft compared to the effect of a whirlwind. Now, earlier it was mentioned that the progressed lunar cycle is best used for the first third of life. And that holds true. It's not to say that the second and the third thirds of life, the second and the third progressed lunar cycles, are unimportant. It's just that they're not as important as the first lunar cycle. That first third of life is all important because how we develop determines on how we're going to be able to live. There is an old wise adage that says, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. And it's in that first third of life that the twigs are bent. After the first third of life, it's my opinion that the third third of life, the third lunar cycle, progressed lunar cycle, is the next most important. This would be after 56. That's when the body begins to degenerate more seriously. And it's important to know when there are crises, and when there are crises that you can do something about. These days, I'm working a lot with people that are closer to my age, which means elderly people, and I'm gaining more experience on that. And so the third third of life is important to me. The difficulty with the elderly is that by the third third of life, most of the damage has been done to their bodies, and you can't do much to change things. You might be able to ameliorate things a little bit, and you might be able to tell when things are in crisis, but it's not something that you can change the way you can change a child by changing its education or changing the way it is treated during its childhood. Now, lunar progressions are going to come up from time to time during these talks. And the 7-year climateracies are going to come up at least 2 more times. And they're going to come up 2 more times in this reckoning of the 3/3 of life. Now, this is as far as we're going to go this evening. Next time, we'll look at another way of looking at the thirds of life and what it means, and eventually we'll be able to put them all together, and when we have a horoscope, we can tell which one is more important, or one might deal with something that is more important with the issue that we're working on. So that's as far as we're going for this evening. Look at that. 55 minutes. I never thought I'd ever give a talk under less than 60 minutes. Thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope this is helpful. I hope this is something that gives you a better understanding of life as well as an understanding of astrology.